My husband always forced me to take birth control because he didn't want children, but I found out he has a child with someone else. My name is Claire Montgomery. For as long as I can remember, I dreamed of being a mother. I thought marriage would naturally lead me there, but I quickly learned that in my marriage, choices were not mine to make. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I never thought the word control would define my marriage, but it did. My husband Daniel was a man who liked life on his terms. From the way our house was decorated to what nights we visited his parents to how money was spent, he had a say in everything. But the greatest control he held over me was over something deeply personal, whether or not I could become a mother. When we first married, I imagined a cozy home filled with children's laughter, sticky hands tugging at me, toys scattered across the living room floor. I saw myself reading bedtime stories, braiding little hair, teaching homework at the kitchen table. But that dream never left the realm of imagination because Daniel made sure of it. He was subtle at first. We'd only been married a year when he said almost casually, "I think we should wait before having kids. Let's enjoy each other for a while." That sounded reasonable, even considerate. I agreed. But the while stretched into years. And with each year, his language grew sharper. "Claire, don't even think about it. I don't want kids. You'll keep taking the pill, won't you?" It wasn't a question, it was an instruction. At first, I swallowed my disappointment along with the pills. I told myself maybe he'd change. Maybe he was just afraid. Men often needed more time to adjust to the idea of parenthood. I tried to be patient, believing that love meant compromise. But what I learned was that compromise in our marriage was one-sided mine. Every time I hinted at wanting children, Daniel reacted with anger that chilled me. "Why can't you just be happy with me, Claire? Are you saying I'm not enough for you?" That single question silenced me. I felt guilty, selfish, even disloyal for wanting more. He twisted my natural desire for children into evidence of my inadequacy as a wife. And so I became quiet. I smiled at baby showers for my friends, congratulated colleagues who announced pregnancies, and swallowed my envy with every cheerful announcement. At night, when the house was dark, I would place my hand on my stomach and wonder what it might feel like to have life growing inside me. Then I would roll over, turn off the thought like a lamp, and pretend sleep came easily. Daniel controlled not just my womb, but my narrative. To the world, we were the successful child-free couple who enjoyed freedom, travel, and financial ease. People envied us. "You two must be so carefree friends," said. I nodded, pretending they were right. What else could I do? Inside, though, the silence of our house was suffocating. A silence filled with everything that wasn't there. There were moments when my resentment broke through like cracks in glass. Once I asked Daniel, "Why are you so against children? What's so wrong with having a family?" He scoffed. "Because kids ruin everything. They suck the joy, the freedom, the money. I don't want to end up like those pathetic couples who lose themselves in diapers and school fees. I didn't marry you to become a babysitter." I remember his words like needles. He didn't see parenthood as growth, but as ruin. And he didn't see me as a woman who wanted fulfillment, but as someone who should obey his rules. So I obeyed. I became good at hiding my longing, but inside it gnawed at me. With each passing year, the ache deepened. I would walk by playgrounds and linger watching children play, my eyes misting as I imagined one of them calling me Mom. I'd hold my breath in the baby aisle at the store, staring at tiny socks and bottles I would never buy. Daniel noticed my silences, of course. He wasn't blind to my emotions. But instead of tenderness, he offered warnings. "Don't start with that face again, Claire. We agreed. No kids. Ever." He made it sound like I had signed a contract. I began to feel less like his wife and more like his prisoner. My life, my choices, my very body were dictated by what he wanted. And the saddest part was that I allowed it. Out of fear of losing him, of being unloved, I surrendered piece by piece until I could barely recognize myself. Looking back now, I wonder how I endured it for so long. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was fear disguised as love. But at that time, I told myself Daniel was just stubborn, that he'd come around eventually, that my patience would pay off. But patience has its limits, and mine was about to meet its breaking point. I didn't know then that Daniel wasn't against fatherhood. He wasn't against children. He was only against having them with me. Because somewhere out there, while I sat at home swallowing my pills and my tears, he was holding another woman close and smiling at the child they shared together. And that truth, when it finally reached me, shattered everything. The silence in my marriage was louder than any scream. Daniel and I moved through the same house like strangers who happened to share a bed. The intimacy between us had shriveled until it was nothing more than routine kisses on the cheek and polite exchanges about groceries. But beneath that civility, something darker stirred. It began with small things. He stopped looking at me when I spoke, as if my words were just background noise. He no longer asked how my day went. When I tried to tell him about the children I taught at school, his response was a bored grunt or a distracted scroll on his phone. At first, I thought maybe this was just what long-term marriage looked like. Couples grew comfortable, I told myself. They settled into silence, but deep inside I knew this was different. It wasn't comfort, it was distance. A deliberate shutting of doors between us. One night, while I was preparing dinner, Daniel came home late. His shirt smelled faintly of perfume, not mine. I stood at the counter chopping onions, my hands trembling as I asked, "You're late. Where were you?" "Work," he said curtly, tossing his jacket over the chair. "At the office," I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady. He shot me a glare sharp enough to slice. "Yes, Claire. Where else would I be?" I wanted to believe him. I forced myself to. But something in me twisted, whispering that the man in front of me wasn't telling the truth. From that day, I started noticing patterns I had ignored before. His sudden business dinners, his phone always face down on the table, the way he flinched if I walked into the room while he was texting. When I asked harmless questions, his answers carried an edge of irritation. "Stop interrogating me. You're acting paranoid." Paranoid. That word stung. It painted me as unstable, insecure, needy. And I began to question myself. Was I imagining things? Had loneliness made me suspicious? But my instincts told me otherwise. Then came the night that seared itself into my memory. It was a Saturday, and Daniel had promised we'd have dinner together. I prepared his favorite meal, roast chicken, seasoned exactly the way he liked it. I even set the table with candles, hoping maybe we could find each other again in the quiet glow of our home. But hours passed and he didn't come. I called his phone. No answer. Texted him. No reply. At nearly midnight, the front door creaked open. Daniel walked in, hair tousled, tie, loosened eyes avoiding mine. "Where were you?" My voice was calm, but beneath it was a volcano of fear and anger. "Out." He shrugged, heading upstairs. "Out where? With who?" He stopped halfway up the stairs, turned, and looked at me with icy disdain. "Why does it matter? Stop acting like a child, Claire." And just like that, he disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me downstairs with the cold candles and the uneaten dinner. I sank into the chair, tears spilling before I could stop them. But even as I cried, another feeling rose inside me, suspicion that no longer whispered but screamed. Something was going on. Something Daniel didn't want me to see. The following week, more cracks appeared. He came home with a small scrape on his wrist, and when I asked what happened, he muttered something about fixing a drawer at work. But the mark looked like a child's fingernail scratch. I recognized it instantly. I had seen it often enough in my classroom. Children, when they clung too tightly, often left those marks. The realization made my stomach churn. I tried to dismiss it, tried to tell myself I was overthinking. But every new inconsistency piled on top of the last until the weight was unbearable. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving school, I ran into a colleague who lived near one of Daniel's supposed work meeting locations. She mentioned casually, "I think I saw your husband the other day. He was at the park, with a woman and a little boy. They looked like such a happy family." Her words pierced me. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. Oh, must have been someone who looked like him. But my heart pounded so hard I thought it might break through my chest. On the walk home, I couldn't stop picturing it. Daniel in the park smiling, with a child, with someone else. For years he had told me children were a burden, that he never wanted them. And yet, could it be? The thought made me feel like the ground beneath me was shifting, tilting, pulling me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. That night, when Daniel came home, I watched him closely. His smile when he greeted me didn't reach his eyes. His shirt smelled faintly sweet like baby lotion. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat, because part of me was terrified of the answer. Instead, I set his dinner on the table, my hands shaking as I placed the plate before him. He ate without looking at me while I sat across from him in silence, staring at the man who was beginning to feel like a stranger. It was then I realized my marriage wasn't just cold. It was hiding something. And I wasn't paranoid. I was finally seeing the truth peeking out from the shadows. And the shadows were only getting darker. The walls of our house were too quiet. Some evenings I would sit in the living room with the television off, just listening, not because there was anything to hear, but because the silence pressed against me like a weight. Silence is different when you long for something more. For me, it was the absence of small feet pattering across the floor, the giggles of children running down the hallway, the chaos of a home alive with family. Instead, all I had were empty rooms, and Daniel's cold presence, a man who had turned our marriage into a hollow partnership. At school, my life was filled with children, their laughter, their cries, their endless questions. I loved them even when they tested my patience. But every time I looked at their bright little faces, I was reminded of what I had been denied. One day, one of my students, a sweet girl with curly brown hair, handed me a handmade drawing. It was of her family, all holding hands. "This is us," she said proudly. "And that's you, Miss Montgomery. I put you next to me because you're my favorite." I smiled, thanked her, and tucked the picture away. But later, when I was alone, I stared at it until my eyes blurred with tears. A child who wasn't mine had given me a role in her family portrait. It was touching, yes, but it was also a cruel reminder of the family I'd never have. When I came home that evening, Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "You're late," was all he said. "I stayed a little longer at school," I explained. "One of my students." "I don't need the details." He cut me off, scrolling with disinterest. That was the pattern now. Whatever I said, he dismissed. Whatever I felt, he ignored. Our conversations had become exchanges of necessity: bills, groceries, logistics. Everything else was silence. But silence has its own language. His phone always face down, his sudden emergency meetings, his eyes avoiding mine like I was asking questions with every glance. And in that silence, my longing grew unbearable. I wanted children not just because of instinct, but because motherhood was woven into who I was. To nurture, to care, to love, these were not optional for me. And Daniel knew that. He had known since the beginning. Yet he chained me to his decision, forcing me to live a life that wasn't truly mine. The resentment festered. Sometimes I would imagine leaving, packing my bags, walking out the door, finding a life where I could finally breathe. But then I remembered the years invested, the house we shared, the vows I had once taken seriously. And more than that, I feared the shame. What would people say if I left my husband? They would whisper that I was selfish, that I couldn't make my marriage work. So I stayed. But staying didn't mean peace. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I heard children laughing outside. I peeked through the curtains and saw the neighbors playing in their yard, tossing a ball back and forth, their golden retriever barking happily. My chest ached as though a fist had gripped my heart. When Daniel came home later, I asked cautiously, "Do you ever regret your decision about not having children?" His expression hardened instantly. We've had this conversation, Claire. Don't bring it up again. It's not just a conversation, Daniel. It's my life, too. He slammed his hand against the counter. Your life. Everything you have is because of me. Don't you dare act like you're suffering. You're ungrateful, Claire. Ungrateful. I froze, the echo of his anger filling the kitchen. My throat closed up, and for the 100th time I swallowed my words. But deep inside, something shifted. It wasn't only about children anymore. It was about control. About the way he silenced me, diminished me, made me question my worth. And then came the night that sealed my suspicion. I woke up at 2 in the morning and found his side of the bed empty. His car keys were gone. I waited, heart pounding, staring at the clock as minutes dragged into hours. At dawn, he slipped back into bed as if nothing had happened. Where were you? My voice trembled. Work. At 3 in the morning. Yes, stop asking stupid questions. He rolled over, ending the conversation. But my mind didn't stop. I pictured him somewhere else, somewhere he didn't want me to know. And worse, with someone else. For the first time, I let myself truly consider it. Daniel wasn't just hiding from me. He was living another life. I tried to convince myself it couldn't be true, that my loneliness had twisted my thoughts. But the image of him at the park with a child, the rumor whispered by my colleague, wouldn't leave me. At school, surrounded by children, I found myself spiraling between heartbreak and rage. Why was I denied the joy of motherhood while he might be giving it to someone else? The irony burned. At night, I wandered the house aimlessly, pausing in rooms that might have been nurseries. I would stand in the guest room, picturing a crib against the wall, soft blankets folded neatly, a mobile hanging above. My imagination filled the silence with phantom cries and laughter that never came. And in those moments, the emptiness of the house was deafening. I realized then that my home wasn't just quiet, it was hollow. A shell of a life that never truly began. But one thing was becoming clear: silence couldn't hide the truth forever. Because soon, the truth would crash through that silence like glass shattering on the floor. Saturday morning, the kind that should have felt peaceful, but instead left me restless. Daniel had gone out early, claiming he needed to run errands, though he hadn't specified what kind. I sipped my coffee on the porch, the silence of the neighborhood settling around me like a fog. That's when Mrs. Caldwell, our neighbor from 2 houses down, stopped by. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything: the color of your curtains, the time you took your trash out, the way you greeted the mailman. A friendly gossip, never cruel, but never quiet either. She leaned against the porch railing, fanning herself with the newspaper. I saw Daniel yesterday, she said casually. I smiled politely. Oh, at the office. She tilted her head. No, dear. At the park. With a young woman. And a little boy. Sweetest boy, maybe 3 years old. They looked like a family. The words struck me like a stone to the chest. My fingers tightened around my mug until I thought it might shatter. You must be mistaken, I said quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded far too thin. Daniel doesn't like children. Mrs. Caldwell raised her eyebrows, unconvinced. Well, maybe it was someone else. But he looked just like your husband. Tall, broad shoulders, that sharp jawline. Hard to miss. I nodded, muttering something about coincidences, but inside my world tilted. The moment she left, I sat frozen, replaying her words over and over. Daniel at the park. With a woman. With a child. Smiling, playing, looking like a family. I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but a voice deep within whispered, this explains everything. His late nights. His coldness. His irritation whenever I mentioned children. Could it be that he wasn't against fatherhood at all? Only against fatherhood with me? The thought hollowed me out. I pressed my hands to my face, willing the tears to stop, but they came anyway, hot and relentless. When Daniel returned home that afternoon, I studied him like I was seeing him for the first time. He carried grocery bags, set them on the counter, and greeted me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. His shirt smelled faintly of cologne, too fresh, as though he had tried to mask something. Where did you go this morning? I asked, my voice too casual, too sharp around the edges. Store, he replied flatly, unpacking the bags. Which one? He looked up, his eyes narrowing. Why are you interrogating me, Claire? Don't you have better things to do? I swallowed the urge to scream. Instead, I forced a smile, nodded, and let him walk away. But the doubt refused to loosen its grip. In the days that followed, I started noticing more things. A crumpled receipt in his jacket pocket for a toy store across town. A faint stain on his cuff that looked suspiciously like food smeared by a child's hand. Once I caught him humming softly a tune I didn't recognize, and when I asked about it, he snapped, "It's nothing. Stop listening so closely." The harder I tried to ignore it, the clearer it became. One evening, as I was walking home from school, I passed by a small playground. I froze when I saw him, Daniel, sitting on a bench, his arm draped casually around a woman with chestnut hair. At their feet, a little boy chased a ball, laughing with the kind of joy I'd never heard in our house. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I ducked behind a tree, my heart hammering in my ears. The boy ran to Daniel, tugging at his sleeve. Daniel leaned down, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, and lifted him into his arms. It was undeniable. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagination. This was truth unfolding right before my eyes. I staggered home, my legs shaking, my mind spiraling. My husband had a child. He had created a family not with me, but with someone else. The betrayal burned deeper than I thought possible. Not only had he denied me motherhood, but he had granted it freely to another woman. That night when he came home, I couldn't bring myself to speak. I served dinner in silence, watching him eat as though he hadn't spent the evening living a double life. He didn't notice my trembling hands, my vacant stare. Or perhaps he did and chose to ignore it. In bed, as he slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My chest ached with the weight of everything unspoken. Part of me wanted to shake him awake, to scream, "Why her and not me? Why give her what you stole from me?" But another part of me was afraid. Afraid of hearing the truth spoken aloud. Afraid of losing the last shreds of the life I thought we had. So I stayed silent. But silence could only last so long. Because once you see the truth with your own eyes, you can't unsee it. And I had seen enough to know my marriage was not what it seemed. The whispers had become reality. And soon reality would demand a reckoning. Once the seed of truth was planted, I couldn't stop myself from digging deeper. Every glance, every movement Daniel made seemed suspicious now. It wasn't enough to live with whispers and shadows. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that could no longer be brushed aside as paranoia. So I began watching him, not in the obvious sense. I still smiled when he walked through the door, still asked about his day, still played the role of the dutiful wife. But underneath that mask I was studying, calculating, waiting for him to slip. And he did. One night I was folding laundry when his phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, Elena. My heart skipped. I reached for it instinctively, but the device locked before I could see the message. Still, the name branded itself into my mind. Elena. Later, when I asked casually, "Who's Elena? I think your phone buzzed earlier." Daniel's expression changed for just a flicker, surprise, then irritation. "She's a coworker," he muttered quickly. "Why are you looking at my phone?" "A coworker who texts you late at night." I pressed my voice softer than the storm raging inside. He glared. "You're becoming paranoid, Claire. Stop." That word again. Paranoid. It was his favorite shield, the weapon he wielded to silence me. But this time it didn't work. Because a few days later I found something far more damning. While cleaning out his car, something he never allowed me to do, but he had left it unlocked, I discovered a small plastic bag tucked under the passenger seat. Inside was a child's toy, a tiny red fire truck. It wasn't the kind of thing Daniel would ever buy for himself. My hands trembled as I held it, my reflection warped in the shiny plastic. A fire truck, for a little boy. I shoved it back under the seat before he could notice I'd touched it, but the image stayed burned into my mind. That evening, I watched him carefully. "How was your day?" I asked, setting dinner on the table. "Busy," he replied, chewing without looking at me. Did you stop anywhere on the way home? No, straight here. Lies, smooth, casual lies. It was then I realized I was living with a stranger. A man who looked like my husband, sounded like my husband, but lived a life I was not allowed to see. The more I searched, the more evidence surfaced. A crumpled receipt from a diner across town with 2 meals, ordered one of them a child's portion of pancakes. A faint smudge of blue paint on his cuff, the kind I recognized from the washable paints children used. Every discovery was a dagger, not only because of what it meant, but because of what it revealed about me. That for years I had silenced myself, believing I was unworthy of more. That I had allowed Daniel to dictate my life while he built another one in secret. One night after he fell asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen, the evidence spread before me, the receipt, the toy, the lies that stacked like stones around my heart. I stared at them until tears blurred my vision. I whispered aloud, as if speaking to the empty room, "He has a child." The words were terrifying, final, and yet beneath the fear there was a spark of something else. Not relief, not exactly, but clarity. For the first time, I could no longer deny the truth. Still, I needed more. I needed to see it with my own eyes, not just through scraps and whispers. So I started keeping track of his meetings. Every time he left with a vague excuse, I noted the time. The pattern emerged quickly. Tuesdays and Thursdays, late afternoons, always the same hours. The following week, I made a decision. On a Thursday, when he claimed he had a client dinner, I told him I was staying late at school for grading. Instead, I followed him. My hands were clammy on the steering wheel, my heart pounding as I kept my distance. He drove across town into a quieter neighborhood I didn't recognize and parked in front of a modest 2-story house. I watched as he got out carrying a bag. The door opened, and there she was. The woman from the park, Elena. Her smile lit up when she saw him. And then a little boy came running out, squealing with delight. "Daddy!" The word cut through the night like a knife. I gasped, clapping a hand over my mouth. My husband, the man who had forbidden me from having children, knelt down and scooped up his son, laughing as if the weight of the world had never touched him. I sat frozen in my car, tears spilling unchecked. It was true, all of it. Daniel had built a family, not with me, but with her. When he finally went inside, I drove home in a daze, my body numb, my mind screaming. The house felt even emptier than before, its silence now filled with betrayal. I walked through each room like a ghost, my fingers grazing the walls that had witnessed my loneliness. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid beside his as he slipped into bed hours later. I listened to his breathing, steady and calm, while mine came in shallow bursts. I knew then that something inside me had broken, but in the cracks, something else was forming. Not fear, not silence. Resolve. The next days were a blur of sleepless nights and tense mornings. Every time I looked at Daniel, I saw not the husband I once believed in, but the liar who had stolen years of my life. My mind replayed the image of him lifting that little boy into his arms, the joy in his face, the warmth in his voice, as he answered to Daddy. I had begged him for a child. I had cried silently in the dark, longing for the chance to become a mother, and he had denied me ruthlessly, decisively, while giving everything I yearned for to someone else. It was the sharpest kind of betrayal, not just infidelity, but the theft of my dreams. I couldn't carry the weight of silence anymore. I needed answers. So one evening, I confronted him. We were in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the air as he scrolled on his phone. I set down the dish rag, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "Daniel," I said, "I know about Elena." His head jerked up, his expression flashing from shock to anger in a heartbeat. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," I pressed. My voice cracked, but I pushed through. "I saw you. At her house. With her. With your son." Silence. For the first time in years, Daniel had no immediate comeback. He just stared at me, his jaw tightening. "Say something," I demanded, my hands curling into fists. "Tell me why you told me you never wanted children while you were raising one behind my back." He set the phone down slowly, exhaling through his nose. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. You shouldn't have followed me. The words chilled me. Not an apology. Not a denial. A warning. You've been lying to me for years, I said, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what that's done to me? You let me believe I wasn't worthy of being a mother while you played house with someone else. How could you? Daniel slammed his hand against the counter, making me flinch. Don't twist this, Claire. You're obsessed with children. That's your problem. You never understood that I didn't want that life with you. His words hit harder than any slap. Not with you. It wasn't that he didn't want children. It was that he didn't want them with me. I staggered back, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. So it was never about not wanting kids, I whispered. It was about not wanting me. Daniel's face hardened, his eyes cold. You were never cut out for it. You're too fragile, too emotional. I couldn't risk tying myself down like that with you. Elena, she's different. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. Different. She gave you what I begged for. She gave you a son. Do you know what it's like to ache every day to watch children at school and feel a hole inside you? Do you know what it's like to bury your own dreams because the man you love demanded it? He looked away, his jaw clenched as if my pain was an inconvenience. That was the moment I realized Daniel had never loved me in the way I had loved him. For him, I was an accessory, a wife who looked good on his arm, who filled the role of caretaker and companion without asking for too much. But I had asked. I had asked for something real, something lasting. And for that, he had punished me. I left the kitchen before the tears broke loose, retreating into the bedroom. Behind the closed door, I pressed my face into the pillow and let the sobs rack my body. But even as I cried, a new thought took root. If Daniel could live a double life so brazenly, then I could live one too, not in lies, but in truth. A truth that would expose him, strip away his control, and reclaim what he had stolen from me. The next morning, I watched him dress for work. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, the same confident smirk on his face that I used to find attractive. You're quiet, he remarked. I'm thinking, I replied. About what? I met his gaze in the mirror, my expression calm, almost serene. About how long you think you can keep this charade going before everyone finds out. He froze, his eyes narrowing. Don't you dare. I cut him off. Don't threaten me, Daniel. You've taken enough from me. You don't get to take my voice too. For once, he had no response. He just turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, but instead of fear, I felt something else: power. For years I had been silent, obedient, controlled, but the truth had freed me. And though the betrayal had shattered me, it had also sharpened me into something stronger. I knew then that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The days after my confrontation with Daniel felt like walking across a battlefield, one wrong step, and the ground would explode beneath me. The air inside our home was thick with hostility. He no longer bothered to hide his disdain. His words were sharper, his tone colder. If before there had been distance, now there was war. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, I tried to speak to bridge the canyon between us. Daniel, we need to talk about what happens next. He cut me off immediately, stabbing his fork into his food. There is no next, Claire. You'll keep living your life the way it is, and I'll live mine. That's how it's going to be. My chest tightened. Do you even hear yourself? You've been lying to me for years. You can't expect me to pretend everything is normal. His eyes flicked up, blazing with anger. You think you've been mistreated. You think you've suffered. You don't know what suffering is. You should be grateful. Do you know how many women would kill to live the way you do? A nice house, no kids, to drain you freedom from responsibility. And still you complain. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. I never asked for freedom. I asked for a family. And you robbed me of that. Daniel laughed bitterly, a sound that scraped against my nerves. Robbed you? No, Claire. I saved you. You would have been a terrible mother, too sensitive, Too weak. You cry over your students for God's sake. How could you handle a child of your own? The cruelty in his words sliced through me, but I refused to flinch. For years I had absorbed his barbs in silence, letting them eat away at me. But now they only fueled my fire. I set my fork down with deliberate calm. You're wrong, Daniel. I would have been a wonderful mother, but you never gave me the chance. He slammed his hand against the table, the dishes rattling. Enough, you will not talk back to me in this house. I stared at him, my voice low but firm. This house stopped being a home the day you chose to build another one without me. The silence that followed was suffocating. He glared at me for a long moment, then pushed his plate away and stormed out, leaving me alone with the shattered remnants of dinner. I sat there trembling, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Because his cruelty no longer broke me, it exposed him. Every insult, every attempt to diminish me, only made it clearer Daniel's power over me was slipping, and I was ready to take it back. That night, I began my own quiet war. While Daniel slept, I retrieved the small fire truck toy from under his car seat, sliding it into a drawer in my nightstand. I gathered the crumpled receipts, the scraps of evidence he had carelessly left behind. I photographed everything on my phone, creating a hidden album labeled with an innocuous name. At school, I confided in no one. Outwardly, I was the same Claire, smiling at my students, grading their assignments, offering gentle encouragement. But inside, I was transforming. Every whispered daddy I'd overheard in my mind, every memory of his denial hardened me into something unrecognizable, something stronger. I followed him, twice more careful to stay far enough behind that he wouldn't notice. Each time he went to Elena's house, each time the boy ran into his arms, each time my heart cracked but also solidified into steel. I watched from my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned pale. There he was, the father he claimed he never wanted to be. The liar who had stolen my future. And yet, as much as it tore me apart, I needed to keep watching. Because seeing the truth with my own eyes meant I could never again be gaslit into silence. One evening, when he returned home later than usual, I confronted him again. You were with them, I said, my tone flat certain. Daniel smirked, loosening his tie. And if I was? What are you going to do? Claire, cry about it? His arrogance stoked the fire inside me. No, I replied quietly. Not cry. I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are. His smirk faltered. Don't threaten me. It's not a threat, I said, my voice calm, steady. It's a promise. He stepped closer, towering over me. You think anyone will believe you? You've been desperate for kids for years. Everyone knows it. You'll sound bitter, crazy, paranoid. That word again, paranoid. He clung to it like armor. But this time, it didn't pierce me. Maybe I admitted, but evidence speaks louder than words, and I have plenty of it. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, not disdain, but fear. And that fear told me I was winning. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the tension between us like a live wire. But instead of despair, I felt something unfamiliar: power. Because Daniel could no longer control me with his lies. I had the truth, and I was ready to use it. Still, the question loomed heavy. What would I do with it? Expose him to his family, to his colleagues, confront Elena herself. The possibilities swirled in my mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But one thing was certain: Daniel's reign over me was ending. And soon the world would see the man behind the mask. After years of silence, the decision came to me with startling clarity. I would no longer be the obedient wife who swallowed her dreams for the sake of keeping peace. I would no longer be silenced by Daniel's accusations of paranoia or weakness. If he thought he could live a double life, then I would expose it. Not with shouting or desperation, but with quiet, deliberate resolve. For too long I had been afraid of losing him. But what was I holding on to? A husband who despised me? A man who lied, who built a family with another woman while chaining me in the shadows? No, I had already lost him long ago. What I had left was the power to choose how the story ended. I began documenting everything, every late-night absence, every receipt, every lie. I bought a small notebook and kept it hidden inside my desk at school, where Daniel would never look. Each entry was dated time-stamped meticulous. April 14th. Daniel left at 6:45 p.m., returned 11:30 p.m. Claimed, work meeting. Receipt in pocket from Diner Kid's meal ordered. I took photos whenever I could, the toy truck, the smudge of paint, the receipts. And when I followed him again, careful, always careful, I captured the moment on my phone. Daniel walking hand in hand with Elena. Daniel kneeling to hug his son. Daniel laughing in a way he never laughed with me. The images broke me, but they also fortified me. With every click of the camera, I reclaimed a piece of the power he had stolen. At home, I played my role flawlessly. I smiled at him when he came home, set dinner on the table, pretended to accept his excuses. But my silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. He didn't suspect how much I knew, how much I was gathering. To him, I was still the Claire who would never dare cross him. And that illusion gave me room to plan. Yet in the quiet hours when I was alone, the pain was unbearable. I would sit in the guest room, the one that could have been a nursery, and imagine what might have been. I pictured walls, painted soft yellow shelves lined with stuffed animals, a crib tucked into the corner. I would close my eyes and hear phantom laughter, the life I had begged for, but would never have. Tears came often, but they no longer drowned me. They sharpened me. Each tear was a reminder of what I had endured, and why I could never let Daniel's betrayal remain hidden. One Sunday afternoon, as I graded papers at the kitchen table, Daniel walked in with that familiar arrogance, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Elena invited me to dinner tonight," he said, not even bothering to cloak it with an excuse. I froze, pen in hand. "You're not even pretending anymore." He smirked. "Why should I? What are you going to do, Claire? Tell the world. No one will believe you. You'll sound bitter, pathetic. Just like you always have." I forced my face to remain calm even as fury boiled beneath my skin. "Maybe you're right," I said softly. "Maybe no one will believe me. But I don't need them to. I only need the truth." He laughed cruelly. "Truth. Truth doesn't matter, Claire. Perception does. And everyone perceives me as the successful husband with the perfect life, while you're just the lonely wife who couldn't give him what he wanted." His words were poison, but they didn't kill me this time. They crystallized into resolve. I thought to myself, let him keep underestimating me. That will be his downfall. The next week, I visited a lawyer under the pretense of seeking advice for a friend. I asked about infidelity, about financial entanglements, about what counted as evidence. The lawyer's answers gave me exactly what I needed: confirmation that the receipts, the photographs, the timeline I had compiled could expose him legally as well as morally. When I left the office, the air outside felt lighter. For the first time in years, I felt as though I was standing on solid ground. But revenge, I decided, wasn't only about destruction, it was about reclamation. I started making small changes in my own life, subtle shifts Daniel wouldn't notice. I opened a separate bank account, depositing small amounts of money from my salary each week. I began reconnecting with old friends, people I had let drift away under Daniel's control. I spoke more freely at school, no longer censoring myself for fear of seeming too emotional. And slowly, I felt myself coming back to life. Daniel noticed, of course. "You've been acting strange," he remarked one evening, watching me with narrowed eyes. I smiled faintly. "Have I?" He didn't know what to make of it, and that uncertainty unsettled him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. One night, as he slept soundly beside me, I whispered into the dark, "You think you've silenced me, but soon the whole world will hear what you've done." It wasn't a threat, it was a vow. From that moment, my plan sharpened into focus. I would bide my time, keep building my case, keep pretending to be the wife he thought he owned. And when the moment was right, I would strike not with screams or pleas, but with undeniable truth. The truth that he could never again bury under accusations of paranoia. The truth that would unravel the careful image he had built. The truth that would set me free. The more I uncovered, the less human Daniel became in my eyes. He was no longer my husband, not even the cruel, controlling version I'd come to know. He was a stranger who had constructed an entire second life, a man whose lies stretched farther than I could have imagined. And with every secret revealed, my fury deepened. It started with a bank statement. I hadn't meant to see it, not at first. But one evening while he showered, he left his briefcase open on the desk. A thick envelope of paperwork slid out. My hands shook as I unfolded the pages. There it was. Transfers. Regular payments. Not huge sums, but steady ones enough to support someone comfortably. The account name wasn't familiar at first glance, but the more I studied it, the more I understood. Elena. My stomach dropped. He wasn't just visiting her, wasn't just seeing their son occasionally. He was supporting them. Financially. Consistently. Like a real family. It was one thing to suspect another, to see it in ink. The betrayal I felt in that moment wasn't just emotional, it was practical. For years, Daniel had made me believe we couldn't afford certain things: vacations, home, renovations, even medical bills I had quietly shouldered from my own savings. Yet here he was, funneling money into another household. Our money. I slammed the papers back into the briefcase, my hands trembling. For a moment, I nearly stormed into the bathroom to confront him right then, but something stopped me. The echo of his cruel laughter. The memory of him dismissing me as paranoid. No, this wasn't the time to explode. This was the time to sharpen my blade. The next day, I took careful steps. At school, during my lunch break, I logged into our joint online banking account. I'd never bothered much before. Daniel always handled the finances, but now I scrolled through transactions with new eyes. And there it was again: withdrawals, transfers sometimes disguised as business expenses but always recurring. Always tied to Elena. My heart pounded as I printed copies at the library, tucking them into a manila folder I now kept hidden in the back of my desk drawer. The folder was growing thicker. Receipts, photos, notes, and now bank statements. Piece by piece, I was assembling the story of Daniel's lies. That night, he came home unusually cheerful. He hummed while taking off his shoes, tossed his jacket onto the chair, and greeted me with a kiss that felt rehearsed. "How was your day?" he asked, as though nothing were amiss. I stared at him, forcing a smile. "Fine. And yours?" "Busy. Meetings all day. You know how it is." I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity. Meetings. Always meetings. I wanted to scream, "I know where you've been. I know who you've been with. I know what you've done." Instead, I said softly, "You work so hard, Daniel. I hope it's worth it." He didn't notice the venom laced in my words. He never did. His arrogance blinded him to the storm brewing right under his nose. The following week, I followed him again. By now, I knew the routine. Tuesdays and Thursdays. The little house in the quiet neighborhood. But this time, I parked closer, careful to stay hidden. I wanted to see more, to hear. Daniel walked up the path carrying grocery bags. The door swung open, and Elena stood there, her face lighting up. She kissed him. Not on the cheek, on the lips. The kind of kiss I hadn't felt from him in years. My chest tightened. Then the boy appeared, barreling into Daniel's legs with a squeal of delight. "Daddy." Daniel laughed, lifting him effortlessly, spinning him around in the yard. Elena watched from the doorway, smiling softly, her hand resting on her stomach, in a way that made my heart lurch. Was she pregnant again? The thought nearly drove me to my knees. I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting to keep my sobs silent. My husband hadn't just given me a rival. He had replaced me. When I finally drove away, I couldn't stop shaking. Rage, grief, disbelief, it all churned together until I felt sick. But amid the storm of emotions, a single thought cut through with chilling clarity. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks I'm powerless. He has no idea what's coming. That night, as he sat across from me at the dinner table, scrolling on his phone, I studied him carefully. His shirt smelled faintly of baby lotion again, his hair slightly mussed from the boy's embrace. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. "Daniel," I said suddenly, He looked up annoyed. What? I held his gaze, my voice calm but pointed. What do you think people would say if they knew? He froze for a fraction of a second before scoffing. Knew what, that my wife's gone mad? I smiled faintly, leaning back in my chair. Maybe. Or maybe they'd see the pictures, the receipts, the transfers. Maybe they'd meet Elena and your son. His fork clattered against the plate. His jaw tightened. You wouldn't dare. I tilted my head, still smiling. Wouldn't I? For the first time, I saw the mask slip. His face went pale, his eyes darting not in guilt but in calculation. He was measuring me, testing whether I truly had the courage to expose him. And he saw it then in my steady stare. I did. He leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. If you ruin me, Claire, you ruin yourself. No one will pity you. You'll look like the bitter wife who couldn't handle reality. You'll have nothing. I met his glare with quiet defiance. I already have nothing, Daniel. Nothing you can take from me. But you have everything to lose. His lips parted, but no words came. He pushed his chair back abruptly and stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with the echo of his footsteps. I sat in the silence, my heart still pounding, but this time not from fear, from power. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one trembling under his control. He was. And the question that pulsed through my mind over and over was this: how do you think they will react when I reveal that to everyone? Once the veil was lifted, I could no longer live in passive endurance. The truth was out in the open, if only between us, and Daniel's reaction had told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't ashamed. He was afraid, but only of exposure, not of what he had done to me. That difference mattered. It meant that his heart was not mine to reclaim, nor his loyalty, nor even his respect. All I had left to win was justice, and I knew now that justice would not come from his lips, but from my hands. The time for patience was over. The time for strategy had begun. I started by asking myself the simplest of questions: who needed to know? It would be easy enough to throw my evidence onto social media to humiliate him in one viral swoop. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't precise enough. No, the knife needed to cut where it hurt most. Daniel valued three things above all else: his reputation in our community, his standing in his family, and his carefully curated image at work. Those were the pillars he stood upon, the facade that let him sneer down at me and everyone else. So my plan was clear: I would aim for the pillars. The first pillar: his family. Daniel's parents lived only a few miles away, deeply traditional people who prided themselves on their son's stable marriage and perfect household. They adored me in the superficial way in-laws often do, always polite, always warm, but always blind to the cracks I hid beneath my smile. I imagined their faces when they learned their son had fathered a child with another woman, all while denying me motherhood. I imagined their disappointment, their shame. That thought fueled me. The second pillar: his workplace. Daniel was an executive at a mid-sized firm, the kind of job that demanded appearances. Family barbecues, networking events, company parties. He always paraded me like a prized accessory, the loyal wife who stood by his side. But what would his colleagues say when they saw the photographs? When they realized the man who claimed to sacrifice for his career was living a lie so brazen it bled into every corner of his life? He had built a fortress of credibility, but I had the dynamite. The third pillar: our friends. Over the years, Daniel and I had cultivated a circle of acquaintances, people who admired him for his confidence and envied our so-called freedom as a childless couple. They pitied me occasionally, I could tell, assuming I was the one who didn't want children. That assumption had shielded Daniel, but it also gave me the ultimate weapon. When they learned the truth, their pity would twist into anger, into outrage, and Daniel's carefully guarded mask would crumble. With my targets identified, I began refining my evidence. Every evening after Daniel went to bed, I sat at my desk with my folder and my phone. I organized the receipts, chronologically clipped them to the bank statements, and wrote notes beside each photo. I created a timeline so clear and detailed that no one could dismiss it as coincidence or speculation. I even printed the photos Daniel holding his son Daniel walking with Elena and tucked them into protective sleeves. When the time came, I wanted to be able to lay them out like a prosecutor in a courtroom. The weight of the folder grew heavier, but so did my resolve. Meanwhile, I played the role of the dutiful wife with a precision that surprised even me. When Daniel returned home late, I greeted him calmly. When he lied about his meetings, I nodded and smiled. When he mocked me for being emotional, I bit back the urge to lash out. Because I knew every lie, every insult, every smug dismissal was just more rope for him to hang himself with. And slowly I began to notice his arrogance faltering. One night, as we sat in the living room, I caught him watching me out of the corner of his eye. His expression was wary, almost unsettled. He sensed something had changed in me, but he couldn't name it. That was my advantage. The opportunity for confrontation came sooner than expected. Daniel's parents invited us for dinner, a small family gathering, nothing unusual. But as soon as I received the invitation, I felt the storm gather in my chest. This was it. This was where the first pillar would crack. I spent the week preparing, not just the evidence, but myself. I rehearsed my words in the mirror, practiced steadying my voice, trained myself not to flinch at Daniel's inevitable rage. When the evening came, I dressed with care. A simple black dress, modest but elegant. I wanted to look composed, unshaken, the kind of woman people would believe. Daniel, oblivious, complimented me on the way out the door. "You look nice tonight." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, so do you." Inside, I was trembling with anticipation. Dinner began pleasantly enough. His mother served roast beef, his father poured wine, and the conversation flowed easily. Daniel relaxed, slipping back into his role as the charming son, the successful executive, the devoted husband. He had no idea what was coming. At one point, his mother turned to me, smiling warmly. "Claire, you've been married so many years now. Do you ever regret not having children?" The table went quiet. Daniel stiffened beside me, his jaw tightening. He started to speak, but I placed my hand lightly on his arm, silencing him. I looked at his mother, my smile calm, my voice clear. "Yes, I regret it deeply, but it wasn't my choice." His father frowned. "What do you mean?" I took a slow breath, then pulled the folder from my bag and placed it on the table. "I mean that Daniel forbade me from having children. He told me it would ruin his life. And while I lived in silence, longing for a family, he was building one with someone else." Gasps filled the room. His mother's hand flew to her mouth. His father's face turned red. Daniel leapt to his feet, his voice sharp. "She's lying. She's making this up." But I opened the folder calmly, sliding a photo across the table. Daniel kneeling in the grass, holding his son in his arms. The silence that followed was deafening. His mother whispered, "Daniel, is this true?" He stammered, sputtered, but no words came. His mask had cracked, and the truth spilled through. I sat back in my chair, my heart steady for the first time in years. Because this was only the beginning. The moment the photo hit the table, the world shifted. Daniel's parents, who had always looked at him with pride, stared in stunned silence. His mother's face went pale, her hand trembling against her lips. His father, usually so composed, turned rigid, his eyes narrowing with disbelief, and then with fury. Daniel stood there, jaw tight, fists clenched. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "Claire's twisting things. She's obsessed with the idea of children, and now she's making up lies to make me look bad." I didn't flinch. I reached calmly into the folder again and slid another piece of evidence forward. A bank statement, the highlighted line showing the recurring transfer to Elena's account. "Is this made up too, Daniel?" I asked quietly. "Are the numbers on your own account imaginary?" His father leaned forward, reading the paper, his face growing darker by the second. "Daniel, explain this." Daniel's lips moved, but no words came out. For once, he didn't have the quick, dismissive excuses he always used to silence me. He looked cornered, his mask slipping piece by piece. I kept my voice steady, deliberate, every word a hammer on the fragile walls of his lies. For years, I begged for a child. and Daniel told me it would ruin his life. He forced me to take pills, shamed me for wanting a family. He made me believe I was unworthy, too fragile to be a mother, and all the while he was raising a son with another woman. Gasps filled the dining room. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears, shaking her head as though denying reality. His father slammed his fist against the table. "Is this true?" He barked at Daniel. Daniel finally erupted, his voice raw with anger. "Yes, fine. It's true, I have a son." But what of it? Claire was never cut out for motherhood. She's too weak, too emotional. I did what was best for myself. The words hung in the air like poison. His mother's sob broke the silence. She pushed her chair back, covering her face. His father stood slowly, his expression thunderous. "You have disgraced this family, Daniel, to treat your wife this way, to deceive us, to lie about something so sacred." He shook his head as though he could hardly believe the son he had raised had done such a thing. Daniel's face twisted with rage, but beneath it I saw something else: fear. Not of me, but of the people whose approval he had lived his entire life to protect. I pressed on, my voice calm but sharp as glass. "You thought you could silence me, Daniel. You called me paranoid, weak, pathetic. But the truth speaks louder than your lies." His father turned to me, then his expression softening. "Claire, I had no idea." "I know," I said quietly, "because he made sure no one knew. He controlled everything, even me. But I won't stay silent anymore." Daniel lunged forward, snatching the folder from the table, papers scattering across the floor. "Enough. This ends here." But it was too late. The images had already seared themselves into their memories. His parents had seen enough. His father pointed to the door, his voice thunderous. "Get out. Leave my house." Daniel froze, stunned. "Dad, you can't." Now. For the first time in his life, Daniel looked small. He snatched his coat, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by his mother's quiet sobs. I bent to gather the scattered papers, my hands steady, even as my heart pounded. His father placed a hand gently on my arm. "Claire, I'm sorry you endured this." I met his eyes, and for once I let the tears fall. "It's not your fault. But it's not over yet. Everyone needs to know who he really is." In the days that followed, Daniel's calls to his parents went unanswered. His father, I later learned, had confronted him privately, threatening to cut him off financially if he didn't come clean. His mother refused to speak to him at all. And I knew then that the first pillar had cracked. But I wasn't finished. The second pillar, his workplace, would be next. Daniel's company was hosting a quarterly dinner, one of those gatherings where executives paraded their spouses to impress clients. Daniel insisted we attend together, perhaps in an attempt to regain control of the narrative. I agreed, masking my intentions behind a smile. The night of the dinner, I dressed carefully, choosing a navy dress that gave me quiet authority. I pinned my hair, neatly painted my lips red, not for him, but for me. For once, I wanted to look like the woman he had underestimated for so long, strong, unbroken, and in command of her truth. Daniel, of course, was in his element. He laughed too loudly, shook hands too firmly, charmed everyone with the ease of a man who believed the world adored him. He kept his hand on the small of my back, guiding me like a prop. But as he spoke about sacrifices for his career, about the balance of work and home, I felt my anger rise like fire in my chest. When the conversation turned to family, a colleague joked, "Daniel, when will we finally see little ones running around?" He smirked, glancing at me. "Ah, Claire and I decided we enjoy our freedom. Kids aren't in the cards for us." That was my moment. I smiled sweetly at the table, my voice clear. "That's not entirely true. Daniel does have a child. With another woman. A little boy about 3 years old." "Isn't that right, Daniel?" The table went silent. Forks clinked against plates. Every eye turned to him. Daniel's face drained of color, then flushed red. "Claire, stop it." But I reached into my bag and laid a single photo on the table, Daniel holding his son in the park. The resemblance was undeniable. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." I leaned back in my chair, my smile calm. Funny how the truth has a way of coming out. Daniel shoved back his chair, muttering something about crazy lies, but the damage was done. His colleagues exchanged looks, whispers spreading like wildfire. His reputation, the image he had so carefully crafted, was unraveling before his eyes. I watched him leave the room, his shoulders hunched, his mask shattered. And for the first time in years, I felt the taste of victory on my tongue. That night, alone in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything I had lost. My marriage, my trust, the dream of a family with the man I once loved. But beneath that grief, there was a different truth. I had found my strength again. The second pillar had fallen. One more remained. And when it did, Daniel's double life would crumble entirely. By the time the company dinner ended in chaos, Daniel's world was already cracking. His parents had turned their backs on him, his colleagues whispered behind his back, and the mask of superiority he had worn for years was slipping beyond repair. But I wasn't finished. There was one last pillar holding him up: our circle of friends, neighbors, and acquaintances, the people who believed the lie of our happy, child-free marriage. These were the ones who pitied me in silence, assuming I was the one who didn't want children, the one who had denied Daniel. I couldn't let that narrative live any longer. The truth had to be spoken where it mattered most, in front of the people who had been closest to us. So I waited for the perfect opportunity, and fate delivered it. One of our friends, Marissa, was throwing a birthday party for her husband. She invited our whole circle, including us. When Daniel told me about the invitation, he tried to sound casual, but I saw the hesitation in his eyes. He knew every gathering now carried risk. "We don't have to go," I said, my tone light, almost playful. "No, we're going." He snapped quickly, as though refusing would look like weakness. I nodded, hiding the small smile that tugged at my lips. Exactly what I wanted. The night of the party, the air buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Music played softly in the background, and everyone mingled with easy familiarity. Daniel, ever the actor, slipped back into his charming persona, shaking hands, telling jokes, and pretending nothing was wrong. I watched him from across the room, his smile wide, his voice loud. He thought he still had control. But he didn't know what I carried in my bag, the folder heavier now with everything I had collected. As the evening stretched on, the conversation turned, as it always did, to family. Marissa teased one of our friends who was expecting her second child. "You're going to be busy. 2 under 2, bless you." Everyone laughed, and then someone asked Daniel, "When are we going to see little Montgomerys? Or, have you two decided kids aren't for you?" He chuckled smoothly, giving the same line he always did. "Claire and I love our freedom. Kids just don't fit into our lifestyle." The table murmured in agreement, a few people glancing at me with pity. That was when I stood, my voice calm but cutting through the noise. "That's not true." The room went silent. All eyes turned to me. Daniel froze, his smile vanishing. I stepped forward, my hands steady, my voice unwavering. "For years, Daniel told me we couldn't have children. He made me take pills, told me I wasn't cut out to be a mother. And I believed him. I suffered in silence while everyone assumed it was my choice." I pulled a photo from my bag and held it up. Daniel in the park, his son clinging to his shoulders, both of them laughing. But while I lived in that silence, he was raising a child with another woman. Gasps filled the room. People leaned closer, squinting at the photo, their mouths falling open as they recognized him. Daniel's face turned crimson. "Claire, stop this madness." He barked, his voice trembling with fury. But I ignored him. I spread the evidence across the table: receipts, bank statements, photographs. Here is the truth. While I was denied motherhood, he gave it freely to Elena. He built a family with her and lied to every single one of you about who he was. The room erupted. Voices overlapped: disbelief, outrage, questions flung like stones. "Is this real?" "Oh my God, Daniel! You said you didn't want kids." Daniel slammed his fist against the table. "She's lying. She's obsessed. Jealous, bitter." But his voice was drowned out by the murmurs, The shifting eyes, the way people began pulling back from him as though he were a snake they hadn't realized they were standing next to. Marissa's husband, usually one of Daniel's closest friends, shook his head in disgust. "You've been lying to us for years." "It's none of your business," Daniel shouted. "My life is my own." "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the chaos. "You made it their business when you paraded me around as the perfect wife while you lived a double life. You humiliated me, controlled me, silenced me. But you don't get to control the story anymore. Not here. Not ever again." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's eyes darted around the room searching for an ally, but there were none left. Everyone had seen the evidence. Everyone knew. And in that moment, his last pillar collapsed. When we got home that night, Daniel exploded. "You've ruined me," he shouted, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "Do you understand what you've done? My parents, my colleagues, my friends, they'll never look at me the same way again." I stood in the doorway, calm despite his rage. "Good, because now they see who you really are." He turned on me, his face twisted with fury. "You think this is a victory? You've destroyed everything." "No, Daniel," I said quietly. "You destroyed everything. I just stopped cleaning up your mess." His chest heaved, his fists clenched, but for the first time he didn't lunge, didn't shout another word. He just stood there, seething, his power draining away with every breath. I walked past him, my head held high, and went upstairs. That night, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the suffocating silence I had known for years. This silence was different. This silence was freedom. Because for the first time, Daniel no longer owned me. The truth was out. The mask was gone, and he had nothing left to hide behind. When you spend years being silenced, you start to believe your voice has no power. You bury your dreams. You swallow your anger. You convince yourself that peace is worth more than truth. That was me. For more than a decade, I lived in the shadow of a man who dictated my body, my choices, my future. But in the end, it wasn't his control that defined me. It was the moment I chose to break it. After the night of Marissa's party, Daniel never recovered. The whispers spread quickly, as whispers always do. Friends who once admired him stopped returning his calls. Neighbors looked at him differently, with suspicion and disapproval. Even at work, I heard through quiet channels his credibility was shattered. His colleagues couldn't trust a man who had lied so easily, so thoroughly. The double life he had guarded so carefully was crumbling brick by brick. At home, the silence was unbearable for him now. Where once he had relished control, now he couldn't stand the weight of his own collapse. He lashed out at me, less not because he had found kindness, but because he knew the power was gone. His anger no longer scared me. It only revealed his desperation. Sometimes he would try to bargain. "Claire, we can fix this. If you just stop telling people." I would look at him calmly and shake my head. "It's too late for that. The truth is already free." Other times he tried to turn cruel again. "No man will ever want you after this. You'll be alone forever." But I would smile faintly and reply, "Better alone than chained to a lie." And in those moments, I saw it in his eyes, the dawning realization that he had not just lost his reputation, but also the woman he believed would never leave. I filed for divorce quietly, deliberately. The evidence I had collected, the timeline I had kept, the transfers and photos and testimonies, they all formed the backbone of my case. My lawyer told me it was one of the clearest demonstrations of betrayal she had ever seen. Daniel fought at first, of course. He tried to intimidate me with threats of financial ruin, tried to paint me as unstable. But the evidence was undeniable, and the more he fought, the more he revealed himself for what he was, a man grasping at the last shreds of control. The court didn't take long to decide. When the decree was finalized, I walked out of that courtroom lighter than I had felt in years. The papers in my hand were more than legal documents, they were proof that I had survived. I still live in the same house, though it feels different now. The silence no longer suffocates me. I've painted the guest room not in soft yellows for a nursery, but in calm blues and grays, a space just for me, a reminder that my worth was never defined by what Daniel allowed or denied me. Sometimes I still ache when I see children playing in the park. That longing for motherhood hasn't disappeared, but now I no longer feel the sharp sting of betrayal when I imagine it. Because I know the fault was never mine. The cruelty was his. I've started volunteering at a local children's center, spending my weekends surrounded by the laughter and chaos I once thought I'd never know. It isn't the same as having my own child, but it fills a space inside me that Daniel tried so hard to keep empty. And maybe one day I'll build a family of my own in a different way, with people who choose me honestly and without deceit. But even if that day never comes, I know one thing for certain: I am free. Looking back, the greatest tragedy of my marriage wasn't that Daniel betrayed me with another woman. It was that I let myself believe for so long that I didn't have a choice, that I was powerless, but I wasn't. The power was always there waiting for me to claim it, and when I finally did, it was like breathing for the first time. To anyone listening who has ever felt silenced, who has ever been made to believe your voice doesn't matter, hear me now. It does. You matter. Your truth matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Because sometimes revenge isn't about screaming or fighting or breaking someone else down. Sometimes revenge is simply standing tall, telling the truth, and walking away with your dignity intact, while the liar crumbles in the ruins of his own making. That is what I did. That is what set me free. The story of Daniel's betrayal will always be a part of my past, but it no longer defines my future. I define that now. And as I sit here telling you my story, I feel no regret, only strength. Because finally, after all the silence, after all the years of swallowing my pain, I have the last word. And that word is freedom. Slow fade out plus, CTA 200-300 words. This is the end of my story, but it might be the beginning of yours. Maybe you're sitting in silence right now, convinced that no one would believe you, that your truth would be twisted against you. Maybe you've been told you're weak, that you're paranoid, that you should be grateful for the scraps you've been given. But I promise you, you are stronger than you think. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: silence protects no one but the liar. When you speak, when you stand, when you finally say enough, the world shifts. It may not be easy and it may not be without pain, but it will be yours. I lost years to Daniel's control, but I reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my voice. And that, in the end, was the sweetest revenge of all. So I'll leave you with this. What would you do in my place? Would you forgive, or would you expose the truth? Comment below and share your thoughts. And if you've ever lived through betrayal, tell your story. You never know who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories like mine. Because sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon we have.